Hello and welcome to this month's webinar from elttraining.com. I'm Jo Gakonga and it's nice to see you again, sort of. The webinar this month is all about giving feedback on writing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is a good question to start off with, I think, and that's why? Why do we write? Now, just stop me for a minute and think about when you write on a daily basis. When I say write, I don't necessarily mean with a pencil or a pen. I am including, of course, typing and any computer use, all that sort of thing in that category. So it may be for work. Most of the writing I do is for work. It may be emails to friends, so sociable things, shopping lists, all kinds of different things. But it's worth reflecting really on why you write and why your learners want to write. So that's kind of the next question that we need to ask ourselves. If that's why we write, then why do they need to write? Now, it might be for some of the same reasons, but for example, writing emails to friends, the chances are pretty good that they're not going to be writing emails in English to friends, that most of the friends they write emails to are probably going to be people who speak their first language. Not necessarily they may have English speaking friends, but that's the reality. So think about reasons why they might want to learn to write. It may not be the same reasons as you have. Okay, well, here's the one. It was the clue on the slide, wasn't it? Exams and tests. Most exams or tests include some form of writing. For example, all of the Cambridge suite have a writing exam. So it's pretty normal that learners are tested on writing skills. And that might be a very big reason why they want to learn to write. Whether we like it or not, that is the truth. For a lot of learners, they may need to use writing for work. If you're teaching people who are learning for business reasons, if you're teaching academic English, then clearly people are going to need to write for that. So those are another two sort of very major reasons why people want to learn to write. I think writing is often used in the classroom as part of language acquisition, that it's another way of sort of instilling language into our learners, and that it can act very usefully as a reinforcement of the spoken word. In fact, in a lot of classrooms with children, it's probably used as the main way of acquiring language. Actually, certainly that was my experience with French and Spanish. We never spoke it at school, we just wrote it. I'm definitely not endorsing that, but it certainly is a way of reinforcing language, and partly that's because the spoken language goes very quickly and it's very ephemeral, whereas if you write something down you have more time to think about it, so it does give you an advantage in terms of thinking time. In terms of the teacher correcting you as well, of course, it means that it's not ephemeral, it doesn't disappear, it's there on the page and the teacher can come round and see what you've understood or not. So for lots of reasons in the classroom it is useful. And of course it's not just in the classroom, although it's possible to set oral homework for learners. It's much more easy and more convenient, easier anyway, and more convenient to set written homework, and so that's mostly what teachers do. So clearly homework's a big one too. Another thing that's worth mentioning, I think, is that most learners who are literate in their first language will also want to write in a foreign language, and those that aren't literate in a first language, and that's entirely possible if you're teaching EFLESOL in the UK or the US, you may well have people who've come and have had a disrupted education and haven't learned to write in their first language. Well, clearly literacy skills then are also very important coming into a new environment. But what we're mainly going to talk about today is giving feedback on writing. So assuming that you've done the writing, let's think about how you're going to give feedback on that. Now there's a few different ways that you can do this. The first is direct feedback, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute. The other, of course, then is indirect feedback. We're going to talk a bit about using a correction code. You may have come across this, but it's a useful thing to use. We're going to talk about redrafting, and finally we're going to talk about what maybe you should focus on to correct. So let's get started with the first of those. So direct feedback. What I mean by direct feedback is that if you have a learner who's given you this sentence, I am here in UK for 3 months, all you do is correct it. So you show them exactly what they've got wrong and you correct it for them. I have been here in the UK for 3 months. So this is direct feedback. It's telling them exactly what they've got wrong, giving them the answer. Now there are some possible advantages to this. The big one is that learners like it. They like it because it's quite secure. I think it gives them a sense of security. They know what it is then that it should be. So that's something that's, you know, important, I suppose. The other thing is that I think it's probably relatively easy for teachers. You know, it doesn't require a huge amount of it's probably the least difficult way of correcting things, I would say, is just to change the things that they've got wrong. So from that point of view, I think teachers often find it useful. The possible disadvantages, of course, you know, something to everything, isn't there, is that it may not help. Now, the reason that I say may, and I'm going to be coming back to this theme, there's very little research evidence that any kind of correction helps actually. So to some extent you have to kind of go with what feels right for you, I think. That's my opinion. The difficulty I think with direct feedback is that if you've given them all the answers there straight away, they may not be very motivated to look at them. They may kind of go, yeah, and then just put it away on a side, and they may not have actually learnt anything from the process. So another option is to give indirect feedback. And what indirect feedback means is not giving them the exact answer, but sort of helping them a bit. So this might be, okay, here's our example again. You might just underline the things that are wrong, or put a little sign in to show that something's missing. So, you know, you're alerting them to the fact that there's a problem here, but you're not actually telling them what it is. There are sort of even less direct methods of feedback. You could just, for example, say, okay, in this line I'm going to put a star on the side of the line wherever you have a mistake. So if you see 2 stars there on the left hand side, then it means there are 2 mistakes in this sentence. So clearly that's much harder for the learners because they've got to make sure that they understand a lot more. If, you know, to make it even harder, that's dividing it into lines, you could go through the whole piece and just say, okay, there are 9 mistakes in this paragraph, can you find them? You know, so that's even more difficult. So there are different ways of giving indirect feedback, but the idea is that the learner has to do more work to find their mistakes. So of course, you know, the main advantage of this is that hopefully it promotes more engagement, that learners actually have to kind of notice what they've got wrong, and that so then hopefully there's more chance of that sinking in on some kind of level, and they're less likely to make the mistake in the future. I think there's a question here about level. When we're talking about mistakes, sometimes we're talking about mistakes which learners make which they could correct themselves. So my Polish pre-intermediate learner writes you know, I play piano. And if I put a little sign in to show them something missing before piano, they'll go, oh yes, of course, I play the piano. Because they've made that mistake many times, they know that articles are supposed to be there, but it's just a slip. Now, if my pre-intermediate learner, on the other hand, makes a mistake with, let's say, a third conditional sentence or a past modal, then the chances are they haven't learnt that yet. So in that case, direct feedback is better. So if they don't know what's wrong, then clearly indirect feedback isn't going to be very helpful. So it is worth really keeping that in mind. You can only really use indirect feedback if they know what's wrong, but they've just made a slip. If they've got it wrong because they haven't learnt it yet, then you know you're hiding to nothing by telling them it's wrong. They don't know how to correct it. So level makes a big difference. So what we're saying is that at lower levels you're likely to have more direct feedback, and at higher levels, obviously going, but that means progressively you can have more and more indirect feedback as the level gets higher and they've learnt more. So yes is the answer to that. Now again, this is the other good question, does it work? And as I said before, to be honest, we don't know. There is no good research evidence to show that any of this is very effective. There's a nice talk by Rod Ellis, which I'll give you it's on YouTube, and I'll give you the reference for it right at the end, and he does talk about the research in this, but the truth is that there's not really strong evidence that any of this really works. So yeah, well, maybe we just don't do it at all. One way of helping learners with indirect feedback, so it's almost like a sort of a middle house between direct and indirect feedback, is using a correction code. And if you want the posh name for this, it's explicit metalinguistic correction. So what you're going to do essentially is not just highlight for them that they've made a mistake, but tell them in metalinguistic language what kind of mistake they've made. But you're not going to tell them the correct answer. So it's kind of a halfway house. Lots of teachers use this kind of thing. It's pretty common. So one example might be here, for example, got our sentence again that the learner made. As with the indirect feedback, I'm underlining the mistakes and I'm showing them as a problem, but I'm giving them a bit of extra help here. So I'm saying above the am that there's a problem here with the tense. There's a problem with am and the problem is the tense. So I'm not telling him that it should be the present perfect there, but I am telling them that it's the tense that's the problem. And there's a missing word there. So there are clearly the learners have to know what these codes mean. So you are going to have to do a little bit of learner training, showing them what the codes mean. But I would keep it fairly simple. So I tend to do WW if the word is wrong. So for example, if they've written he's very good in mathematics, then in here is the wrong word. It should be at, of course. So wrong prepositions are quite common. Prepositions are difficult in English. So just put a WW there. I think right at the beginning it's worth emphasising with this. I emphasise it very strongly with my learners. You have to tell them that you're doing this for their own good, to make them think about their mistakes, but that if they don't know, they should ask you, and it's fine, you'll tell them that it's not a test. Because I think there's no point in it if they look at it and go, yeah, okay, it's the wrong word, but I don't know which word I should have used. Then you're the teacher and you tell them. But give them the idea that what you want them to do is to try to work it out for themselves first. Another thing is WF for wrong form. So perhaps they've got the right verb here, water is freezing, but they've got the wrong form. So it should be the simple form, not the continuous form. Arguably, you could say this is a tense issue too. Perhaps if they've put an adverb, she dances beautiful, when they should have put she dances beautifully. so they put an adjective instead of an adverb, something like that would be a wrong form. If they've put the singular instead of the plural, something like that. So it could cover a range of different things. Word order, this is a common problem for people. So something like this, where they've got the adverb of frequency in the wrong place, you could just underline the words which are in the mixed up and put WO word order. In this case it's easy clearly because they have to be round the other way. There's only 2 words. It may be that there's more words than that are underlined, which make it a bit more tricky. This I usually use as a sign for missing word. This will very, very often be article problems, but it could be other things as well. Of course, it could be prepositions, dependent prepositions, it could be all sorts of things actually, but things where there's a word missing subject, often a problem. SP spelling, that's a fairly obvious one, and P maybe for punctuation. So something like this with capital letters, with lack of question mark there on the end, for example. It could be for other things if people have capitalised letters in the middle of sentences, or that sort of thing. Punctuation generally I use a P for. So these are sort of the codes that I often use, and I tend to keep it fairly simple. There are lots of different codes that you can use. This is one that I got off the internet from the British Council, so you can see that they've got quite a few of the ones that I have, but they also have other ones like register or not clear, or try rewriting. Now some of these, with the try rewriting, for example, the chances are the learner can't. So I don't know that I would go with that one particularly. But you might find these helpful. So there's no cut and dried right correction code. There's no standard, although some of these are quite common. But what I would say is you need to find a code that works for you and for your learners. Here's another example that I got off the net on dummies.com, and again quite a few of the same things, but they've particularly got a special one that deals with article errors, for example, which may be useful, especially if you're teaching in a country where people have a lot of trouble with articles. Anywhere in Eastern Europe, for example, might be a particular example. They've also got a special one look for count and non-count nouns. Personally, I think that's getting a bit specific, but that might be something you found was useful. So I think that with any of these, it doesn't matter what your code is. My advice would be to keep it fairly simple. Half a dozen, maybe 8 different symbols is probably enough. But as I say, you need to do it something that works for you and for your learners and for the situation. Starting a new sentence, starting a new paragraph might be something that your learners have trouble with, in which case introduce those symbols. So this is the big question again, and again the answer is exactly the same. With any of these things, unfortunately, there is no clear evidence that they work. What I would say though is that learners do quite like the idea of the correction code. That seems to be, in my experience, that seems to be quite a useful thing for learners, and they like it. I think possibly you also have to think, if you're going to use a correction code or use indirect methods generally, you also have to think about whether or not they're going to rewrite drafts of their writing. Now, the difficulty for this, there are several difficulties. It depends a little bit about how you feel about writing and learning from your mistakes. So if you feel that you learn by input, then looking at corrections, direct kind of corrections, direct methods of correction will be effective. So that's one way of learning, is by input. If you feel that you learn more by output, or that learners learn more by output, then you might want to think about you making their own corrections or redrafting. Now, clearly it's not as simple as one or the other. It's clearly a bit of both here, a lot of both, and both are important. The difficulty with making learners do a lot of redrafting is that they often find this process pretty tedious. They often don't want to do it, is the truth. So whether or not it's useful is sort of has to be taken into account, at least, that learners often don't like it. They don't want to write it out again. Something you can do as a halfway house for this is to get them to keep a log of the common mistakes they make, so they don't have to write out the whole thing. Maybe they just write out the mistakes that they make, and then when they write the next time, they go back to this log, and this is often going to be things like articles, prepositions, tenses, word order, the sort of things we've talked about in the correction code. So you could ask them before they write, right, look at the mistakes that you made before, try not to make these mistakes again. Or after they've written, say, right, okay, now I want you to check your work and I want you to look at the mistakes that you made before, see if you've got any of the same mistakes in this writing. So there are ways of using that, I think, and I think that can be helpful. So I suppose the other question really is, what should we correct? Because that's not necessarily an easy answer. Do we correct the content? So we ask learners to write a letter to reserve a room in a hotel, or to write a letter of complaint to their landlord about a broken window, or to write a story, with a romantic ending or something. How much are we going to correct the content, the what they've actually written, the how well they've answered the question? How much do we think about correcting the organisation of something? Now, this might be in terms of use of cohesive devices. So, adverbs, for example, furthermore, next, then, all that sort of stuff. In the beginning, whatever, once upon a time, different organisational tools, but also, organisation within the writing. So not just about using those kind of markers, but also about how well it's organised, how well it flows. Do we correct that? Do we just look at the target language? For example, if we've done some work on narrative tenses, and then we say, right, can you write me a story, please? Do we just correct simple past tenses and other narrative tenses, for example, and not worry about anything else, not worry about the punctuation or the spelling or anything else, just look at the past tenses in that example? Do we look at all language errors? Don't focus on one thing, but do everything. Do we correct everything? No, these are difficult questions to answer, really, and I think there isn't a right answer, because the correct answer will vary depending on your learners, and depending on the situation, and depending on the purpose of the writing. So there are really no hard and fast rules here, but these are things that are worth thinking about. It is worth thinking about that in exams and tests, there's often a very significant part of the marks are for content and organisation. A very significant part of the marks. In IELTS, for example, 1/3 of the marks go to content, 1/3 of the marks go to organisation, and 1/3 of the marks go to language accuracy. So you can get quite a good mark even if your language is pretty awful, if it's if you've answered the question and it's well organised. So that's worth thinking about. Certainly answering the question is often a very important part of marking schemes. So I think that is worth thinking about, especially if your learners are writing for exams and tests. I think if you think about focused correction, so you could say, right, today I'm only going to look at simple past tense. We're only going to look at articles, for example. There are some advantages with doing this, with not correcting everything. One is that you've probably then got multiple examples of the same sort of error. So it gives learners, if it likes it focuses on one particular place in the language. Let's look at this one particular thing for today, and we'll look at a different thing tomorrow, of course, and hopefully with that, I say learners are more likely to notice and learn. I think possibly I should have put a modal in there. Learners might be more likely to notice and learn. That's the theory. Again, the practice is not. It's not always as simple as that. But at least in theory, if they've got, if they're sort of clubbed over the head with the same thing several times, hopefully they'll notice it and learn. I think the other advantage with focus correction is that it does mean you haven't got a whole page of red or pink or green or whatever colour you use to mark pen. I do think it is important that you don't overcorrect. Learners will want you to. They'll want you to correct everything. That's what they'll ask you to do. But I think probably it is pretty discouraging if you get your work back and it's covered in red pen. So that's something to think about too. The other thing about focus correction is that it may be less useful in the long term, because if you have a more general sort of level of correction, they may not get everything now, but maybe it will snag in their mind sometime the different kind of errors that, if you've got 6 or 7 different kinds of errors, maybe these will be picked up slowly over time. So it may be useful to do all of something at one time. It may be useful to do a little bit many times. And again, there's no real good evidence to suggest one or the other. So it's a little bit about how you feel and how your learners feel and how you feel your learners will benefit most. Okay, so it's over to you. I'm going to give you a chance to have a go at something. This is a piece of writing that was given to me by a really nice Yemeni student of mine I had a couple of years ago. This was after the very first lesson that she had with me. I asked her to write something to introduce herself to me, and this is what she wrote. Now I want you to bear in mind that she's 22 years old. You can see that from the top line. So she's quite young. She's just come from the Yemen. She's a really lovely person, very motivated student, and she's written me these nice things about herself. So I'd like you to think about what you would write in correction to this. How would you correct this piece of writing? And do just stop me for a minute and have a think. And as I say, don't just think about the language, think about the person behind it, because I think that really is important. As teachers, we're motivators, and it's really important that we keep in mind that these are people we're talking about. It's not just a piece of writing. So I say, just stop me for a minute and see what you think. Hopefully you did that. I know it's very tempting just to go on, but I think it is worth spending a minute thinking about what you would do. Clearly she has, some of the things she's got in there are very good. Her spelling's pretty good. She's certainly got her point across mostly pretty well. She has a big problem clearly with punctuation, and starting on odd lines is a bit of a funny one, but punctuation is a really big one for her. So this is what I wrote in reply to her. So thank you for telling me about yourself. I'm glad you enjoyed today. I hope you enjoy all of your lessons. I think it really is worth making the effort to engage on a personal level with people and people's writing. People do appreciate it. And I think it hopefully will lower that affective filter and make them feel a bit better about their writing, hopefully motivate them to write more. So I've put take care with capital letters. Every sentence must start with a capital, end with a full stop. And I and countries also have capitals, but not other words. So I've given her some clear guidelines here, because she seems to be quite confused about how you should capitalise or not, what case should be used. So then I've underlined all of your mistakes of punctuation. So I've just covered that. I haven't looked at anything else. Try to correct these mistakes in class. I usually give them a few minutes to try and correct their mistakes. And I've put here, ask me if you're not sure. Remember, this is the first time that she's been in my class, so she wouldn't necessarily know what to do. And well done for your hard work. Again, we've got a bit of a good news sandwich here, which, we always like, don't we? Tell them something nice and then hit them with the meat and then put a bit of bread underneath. So I think that this is, do be aware that these are people, and in this case I think there wasn't any point in making too much of a meal about her other problems. She does have some other problems, not only that, but I thought that's very obviously her main problem and not that difficult to correct. In lots of ways, punctuation is one of the easier things to get right. So I thought it was worth really working on that and sorting that out first. And as I remember, it's her first time in the class. Here's another one. How about spell checkers and grammar checkers as well, using the computer to write? I would say that these are really good, that you shouldn't look on these as cheating or whatever else. They've become so much part of our lives that I think it's absolutely, learners, it's good for learners to learn to spell English words, but English spelling is very difficult, and of course spell checkers won't correct everything. They'll give you all sorts of odd things. I once mistyped important and missed an R out. Well, it didn't spell check it for me, and it could have been quite embarrassing, of course. But I think it is helpful, and it's really worth making sure that learners know how to use these tools. Many of them, of course, will be very computer literate and will know, but if they don't, then I would definitely be teaching them, because I think they're useful tools. I think it's worth thinking about them as useful tools. If you'd like a bit more information on this, especially if you'd like some of the background, if you're interested in the background research and that kind of thing, Dr. Rod Ellis, who is a leading authority on lots in EFLESOL generally, but he's got a very nice written corrective feedback talk on YouTube. The URL for that is just below this video as well, so you can just link to it from there. It's about an hour. And he says similar things to the things I've talked about, but he's got a lot of the research information if you're interested too. So good luck with your marking, and I'll see you next month. Bye bye.